In December 1940, as snowflakes mixed with ash fell over a burning London, the fate of the free world balanced on the edge of a knife that grew sharper with each passing night. The Royal Air Force had triumphed in the Battle of Britain, dominating the skies above the English Channel. But below, in the streets and factories, the Luftwaffe's relentless bombing campaign was tearing the nation apart. London's East End was an inferno. Coventry's ancient cathedral lay in ruins. Liverpool's docks burned day and night. Spread a map across any table in 1940, and the British Empire appeared invincible. That distinctive imperial red colored nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface, from the frozen reaches of Canada to the sweltering plains of India. From the deserts of Africa to the islands of the Pacific, the Union Jack flew over territories containing 500 million souls. But in the bunkers beneath Whitehall, where Churchill's war cabinet met in secret, a handful of men knew a devastating truth that could never be spoken aloud in public. Behind the facade of imperial grandeur, behind the stirring speeches and defiant gestures, the British Empire was hemorrhaging its lifeblood. And that lifeblood wasn't just the young men dying in uniform. It was money. Cold, hard cash, and it was running out faster than anyone dared imagine. Winston Churchill sat alone in his underground war room, cigar smoke curling toward the concrete ceiling, composing what would become one of the most consequential letters in modern history. His recipient was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, leader of the world's most powerful neutral nation. Churchill was perhaps the English language's greatest living master. His words could inspire armies, rally nations, and strike fear into the hearts of tyrants. But this letter required something far more difficult than inspiration. It required humility. It required confession. It required him to admit to America that the British Empire, which had ruled the waves for 2 centuries, which had financed the defeat of Napoleon, which had built the modern industrial world, was completely, totally, and irreversibly bankrupt. The letter stretched across multiple pages. Churchill described the strategic nightmare unfolding in the Atlantic, where German submarines were strangling Britain's supply lines. He detailed the desperate shortage of destroyers, aircraft, and ammunition. But buried within the diplomatic language was a confession that burned like acid. Churchill had to tell Roosevelt that His Majesty's treasury could no longer afford to purchase the materials Britain needed to continue fighting. The British would defend their Ireland to the last breath, Churchill wrote. They would fight on the beaches, in the fields and the streets, but they could not fight without bullets, and they could no longer pay for those bullets. It was a plea wrapped in the flag of survival. It was an admission that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. To understand Britain's economic catastrophe, we must examine the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain remained a financial colossus. The vaults of the Bank of England held billions in gold reserves. British investors owned a staggering portfolio of international assets. British capital had financed railroads stretching across Argentina, mining operations deep in Chilean mountains, and sprawling industrial enterprises throughout the United States. The city of London remained the nerve center of global commerce, insurance, and finance. But the war that erupted in 1939 was unlike any conflict in human history. This was industrialized warfare on an unprecedented scale. It devoured resources at a pace that shattered every pre-war prediction. Steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, copper, explosives. The appetites were insatiable. Britain's island geography, once its greatest strategic advantage, became a critical vulnerability. With continental Europe under Nazi occupation, Britain could no longer trade with its traditional partners. Every necessity had to be imported across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean from North America. And here lay the cruel irony. The United States, the world's greatest industrial power, remained officially neutral. The American public, scarred by memories of the First World War's trenches, wanted nothing to do with Europe's latest bloodbath. They had watched their sons die in French mud between 1917 and 1918, and they were determined never to repeat that mistake. Congress had passed a series of neutrality acts, specifically designed to keep America out of foreign wars. Embedded within these laws was a provision called cash and carry. The principle was straightforward and merciless. Britain could purchase American supplies, but only if they paid in cash, immediately, in full. And Britain would have to transport those supplies using British ships across a submarine-infested Atlantic. No loans, no credit, no payment plans. Cash on delivery, or the weapons stayed in American warehouses. For the first year of the war, Britain opened its veins to meet these demands. The treasury liquidated centuries of accumulated wealth. In an operation codenamed Fish, the British government executed the largest physical transfer of wealth in recorded history. Battleships and ocean liners were loaded with Britain's entire gold reserve, billions of dollars in gold bars, securities, and negotiable instruments, and dispatched across the treacherous Atlantic to Canadian vaults. It was a financial evacuation, as desperate as Dunkirk would later be. By the autumn of 1940, the gold was exhausted. The liquid reserves were depleted. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington, responsible for acquiring American war materials, sat staring at contracts they could not sign because London's treasury officials delivered the same message every day: there are no dollars left. When Roosevelt opened Churchill's letter, he understood immediately what was at stake. If Britain collapsed, Hitler would control all of Europe. The United States would face a hostile, militarized Nazi empire across the Atlantic. But Roosevelt faced a political minefield. He could not simply hand money to Britain. American law forbade it, and American voters would revolt. He needed to craft a solution that appeared to be shrewd business rather than charity. He needed to sell aid to Britain as protecting American interests. This is how Lend-Lease was conceived. Roosevelt presented it to the American press using a homespun metaphor that became famous. If your neighbor's house catches fire, he explained, you don't haggle over the price of your garden hose. You lend him the hose, and when the fire is out, it returns Italiano simpa, generous, neighborly. But behind closed doors in Washington, the actual negotiations bore no resemblance to Roosevelt's friendly analogy. This wasn't a conversation between neighbors. This was a foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a debtor who had run out of collateral. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, was a committed anti-fascist who genuinely wanted Britain to defeat Hitler. But he was also the steward of American taxpayer dollars. His position was uncompromising. Before the United States provided a single cent of aid, Britain must prove it had stripped itself of every asset it possessed. Morgenthau wanted absolute transparency. He demanded a complete financial audit of the entire British Empire. He demanded to see every asset owned by the British government, and every asset owned by private British citizens anywhere on Earth. Bank accounts, stock, portfolios, real estate holdings, industrial facilities, insurance policies. He wanted to verify that Britain wasn't hiding wealth while asking for American charity. The British negotiating team, led by Sir Frederick Phyllis, was stunned. They were being treated not as allies fighting a common enemy, but as a failed corporation undergoing bankruptcy proceedings. Phillips protested. Britain had already surrendered its gold. Forcing the liquidation of long-term investments during wartime would result in fire sale prices, pennies on the pound. These overseas assets generated income that helped feed Britain's population. Selling them would leave the nation destitute after the war, unable to import food or rebuild bombed cities. Morgenthau remained unmoved. His instructions from Roosevelt were explicit. The United States would provide no assistance until Britain had scraped every barrel clean. The logic was brutal but clear. If Britain still possessed assets in America, why should an Iowa farmer subsidize British tanks? Why should American taxpayers foot the bill, while British aristocrats still owned American factories? The most painful example of this forced liquidation was American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was an industrial giant, the largest producer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It was owned by Courtaulds, a British company, and represented one of the crown jewels of British overseas investment. The company was highly profitable, generating millions of dollars annually in dividends that flowed back to London, helping balance Britain's trade deficit. Morgenthau identified American Viscose as his target. He informed the British negotiators they must sell it. The proceeds would be deposited directly into the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons already on order. The British resisted fiercely. They knew the company's true value exceeded $100 million. The forced wartime sale would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau held all the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was working its way through Congress, where isolationists were attacking it, arguing Britain was actually wealthy and attempting to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed proof that Britain was genuinely desperate. He delivered an ultimatum: sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease dies in committee. On March 15, 1941, under crushing pressure from Washington, the British government seized American Viscose Corporation from Courtaulds using emergency war powers. No negotiation, no consent, compulsory acquisition. The sale was conducted by American investment bankers who knew Britain had no choice. It was a distress sale, and they extracted maximum advantage. The final price was approximately $54 million, roughly half the company's actual value. It was legalized theft. The British government had to compensate Courtaulds in sterling back in London, adding to Britain's domestic debt, while the dollars flowed directly to the U.S. Treasury. The American viscose sale marked a turning point. It was the moment Britain's leadership understood the true nature of the special relationship. Britain and America were not equal partners. Britain was a subordinate entity being systematically stripped of assets to purchase its own survival. The United States was absorbing British wealth, not through military conquest, but through contract law and financial pressure. But the liquidation wasn't limited to industrial holdings. While financial negotiators argued over stock prices, another deal was being struck that would reshape global geopolitics. Britain desperately needed destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant vessels faster than British shipyards could replace them. The Atlantic lifeline was being severed. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers First World War era vessels sitting mothballed in American naval yards. These ships were obsolete, rusting, and of marginal value to the modern U.S. Navy. Roosevelt agreed to provide them, but once again, there was a price. He didn't give them as a gift, a traded them, in exchange for 50 agent destroyers. The United States demanded 99-year leases on a chain of British naval and air bases spanning the Atlantic: Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Consider the scale of this exchange. Britain surrendered strategic control over the entire Western Hemisphere approach to its territory. It handed the United States a military footprint that would project American power for a century, all for 50 barely seaworthy ships. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Britain was trading irreplaceable long-term strategic assets for short-term tactical relief. It was the desperate act of a nation pawning family heirlooms to buy groceries. By the time the Lend-Lease Act finally became law, in March 1941, Britain had been systematically stripped. The gold was gone. American investments were liquidated. Strategic bases were leased away. The treasury was empty. Lend-Lease was celebrated publicly as the arsenal of democracy. It was portrayed as a noble gesture of solidarity. And in many respects, it was. Lend-Lease provided the tanks, aircraft, oil, ammunition, and food that kept Britain in the war. Without it, Nazi Germany would likely have starved Britain into submission. But the financial terms established the framework for the Postua order, in which Britain would be the debtor and America the creditor. The aid wasn't a gift. It was a lease. The assumption was embedded that eventually there would be a reckoning. There would be payment. Buried in the Lend-Lease Agreement was a clause called Article 7. Written in dense diplomatic language, this single paragraph contained a poison pill for the British Empire. It stipulated that in exchange for aid, Britain would agree to dismantle its system of imperial preference after the war. Imperial preference was the economic scaffolding holding the British Empire together. It was a tariff system that favored trade within the empire between Britain and Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, and dozens of other territories. British goods enjoyed preferential treatment in empire markets, giving British manufacturers an advantage over American competitors. Article 7 demanded Britain tear down these economic walls. Britain was agreeing to open its empire to American exporters. It was signing the death warrant for its own protected trading bloc. British negotiators fought against Article 7. They understood it meant the economic dissolution of the empire, but they had no leverage. German bombs were falling. U-boats prowled the Atlantic. The treasury was empty. They signed as 1941 turned into 1942, and the United States officially entered the war following Pearl Harbor. The relationship dynamic shifted. America and Britain were now fighting side by side. American soldiers flooded into Britain, transforming the island into a massive aircraft carrier for bombing campaigns against Germany. But the economic disparity only widened. American industry, turbocharged by government spending, exploded in productivity and efficiency. The U.S. economy grew dramatically year after year. Britain's economy, meanwhile, was being cannibalized by total war mobilization. Britain ceased exporting civilian goods entirely. Every factory converted to military production. British manufacturers abandoned markets across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And who filled those vacant markets? American companies. While British factories produced Spitfires and Sherman tanks, American factories produced refrigerators, radios, automobiles, and consumer goods for the global marketplace. The United States was simultaneously fighting the war and capturing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the wealth transfer was complete. The world's gold reserves had relocated from London to Fort Knox. The global financial center of gravity had shifted permanently across the Atlantic. But the final humiliation still awaited. The British believed their immense sacrifice would be honored. They believed that because they had fought alone against Hitler for 2 years, because they had bankrupted themselves to defend civilization, America would treat them generously after victory. They believed Lend-Lease would continue during the transition to peacetime, providing a soft economic landing. They were catastrophically wrong. They had forgotten the lesson of the Visco sale. In high finance, gratitude isn't currency. The moment the war ended, the bill would arrive, and the shock would shatter what little remained of British power. The story of victory's true cost reveals how a nation can triumph militarily while collapsing economically. Britain defeated Germany, but in the process, it defeated itself. It spent its accumulated wealth to secure the present, and in doing so, mortgaged its future to its ally. August 15, 1945. The news electrified the world. Japan had surrendered. World War II was over. In London, massive crowds surged toward Buckingham Palace, chanting for the king and queen to appear. Bonfires blazed. Complete strangers embraced in the streets. It was a moment of pure, overwhelming joy. The forces of tyranny had been crushed. The British Empire had stood against the darkness and emerged victorious. But across the Atlantic in Washington, there was no room for sentimentality. There was only a cold bureaucratic apparatus that had been waiting for precisely this moment. 7 days after victory celebrations began, President Harry Truman signed a document that would devastate Britain's economy more effectively than any Luftwaffe bombing raid. He signed the order terminating Lend-Lease. The cutoff was brutal, immediate, and absolute. As of that moment, all aid ceased. No transition period. No grace period. No warning. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, American cargo ships, loaded with wheat, meat, machinery, and raw materials, bound for British ports received orders to reverse course and return to the United States. The lifeline was severed. The British government reeled in shock. They had assumed aid would continue during Reconstruction. They had assumed their economy, completely distorted by 6 years of total war, would receive time to adjust to peacetime conditions. John Maynard Keynes, the 20th century's most influential economist and a senior advisor to the British government, examined the figures and saw catastrophe. Britain imported half its food and nearly all its raw materials. It had been paying for these imports with Lend-Lease aid. Without those dollars, Britain was bankrupt not in a year, not in months, but immediately. Keynes calculated that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk. The country would default on international obligations. It would be forced to halt food imports. Rations, already meager during the war, would have to be slashed to starvation levels. Industries would lack raw materials. Mass unemployment would follow. Social collapse loomed. There was only one option. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a gravely ill John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship bound for Washington. He was exhausted, weakened by heart disease that would soon kill him. He was perhaps the greatest economic mind of his generation. But he traveled to America not as an intellectual equal, but as a supplicant pleading for mercy. Keynes believed he carried a moral argument. He planned to walk into the U.S. Treasury and argue that Britain had fought alone for 2 years, while America remained neutral. Britain had sacrificed its entire economy to defend Western civilization. Therefore, the United States should provide Britain a gift of $6 billion. Not a loan, but a retroactive payment for the blood and treasure Britain had expended holding the line against fascism. He called it justice. But when Keynes arrived in Washington, he discovered that justice was not a currency the Americans traded in. The mood had shifted. The war was over. The American public was exhausted from paying for Europe's problems. Politicians in Congress viewed the newly elected British Labour government with suspicion. Labour had campaigned on socialist policies and nationalizing industries. American conservatives had no interest in using American capitalist tax dollars to fund British socialist experiments. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were hard-eyed realists. They listened to Keynes with cold detachment. Then they delivered their verdict bluntly. There would be no gift. There would be no grant. There would only be a loan, and it would carry commercial interest rates. Keynes was devastated. He argued passionately. He pleaded. He warned that crushing Britain financially would destroy a vital ally in the emerging confrontation with Soviet communism. But the Americans held every advantage. They knew Britain had nowhere else to turn. The Americans offered a loan of $3.75 billion. It was barely sufficient for survival, and it came with conditions designed to strangle the last remnants of the British Empire's economic independence. The most destructive condition was sterling conversion. The Americans demanded that within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible. This meant anyone holding British pounds could exchange them for US dollars at any bank, anywhere in the world. The Americans framed this as free trade and open markets, but in reality, it was a mechanism designed to destroy the sterling area. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payment in pounds, while prohibiting them from converting those pounds to dollars. This created a closed loop that forced countries like India, Australia, Egypt, and others to purchase British goods, because their sterling holdings were only useful within the British trading sphere. The Americans wanted to demolish that system. They understood that, once the pound became convertible, everyone holding sterling would immediately attempt to exchange it for dollars because everyone wanted American goods, not British ones. American automobiles were superior. American appliances were superior. American industrial equipment was superior. Keynes recognized this condition as a death trap. He knew that the instant convertibility was implemented, there would be a catastrophic run on the pound that would drain the loan within weeks. He fought against it until his failing health made further resistance impossible. But the alternative was national starvation. Reluctantly, bitterly, the British Parliament voted to accept the loan. Members of Parliament described it as a financial Munich. They were appeasing the Americans to survive. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946. John Maynard Keynes died just months later, his heart finally failing under the accumulated stress of trying to save his nation from its closest ally. But the tragedy was only beginning. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in British living memory. Blizzards buried the country in snow and ice. Coal supplies froze solid. Power stations shut down. Factories closed. Millions shivered in unheated homes, lighting candles because electricity was unavailable. Food queues stretched around city blocks. It was in this frozen, dark, miserable winter that the reality of victory truly came home to the British people. They had won the war, but their standard of living was plummeting. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the darkest days of the U-boat blockade, was rationed in peacetime for the first time in British history. The age of austerity had begun. Then the clock struck midnight on the American condition. On July 15, 1947, per the loan agreement's terms, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes had predicted. It was a financial massacre. The instant the conversion window opened, the world rushed to dump pounds. Countries that had been forced to accumulate sterling reserves for years immediately unloaded them to acquire precious US dollars. The American loan, which was supposed to last 4 years, began evaporating. In just 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The hemorrhaging was so severe that government officials watched in horror as their reserves vanished in real time. After just 5 weeks, on August 20, 1947, the British government was forced to suspend convertibility. They slammed the windows shut. They had to return to Washington and admit total, humiliating failure. They had incinerated a massive portion of the loan for nothing. The humiliation was absolute. The British Empire had attempted to play by American rules and had been crushed. This financial weakness had immediate geopolitical consequences. This was the moment when the baton of world leadership was officially passed from London to Washington. In February 1947, the British government sent a secret telegram to the US State Department. It was a message of resignation. For over a century, Britain had been the strategic guardian of Greece and Turkey, preventing Russian expansion into the Mediterranean. But now, with an empty treasury, Britain could no longer afford to maintain troops or subsidize friendly governments in the region. The telegram essentially read, "We are broke. We are withdrawing. If you want to contain communism, you must do it yourselves." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped into the vacuum Britain left behind. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. It had become a regional power struggling to keep the lights on. The economic misery dragged on. In 1949, with the economy still stagnant and reserves critically low, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, £1 had been worth $4.86. In 1949, it was slashed to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became approximately 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Import costs skyrocketed. The cost of living surged. It was an admission that the British economy was no longer competitive on the world stage. But the final bill for the war wasn't paid in the 1940s alone. It was a mortgage spanning generations. The Anglo-American loan of 1946, the money borrowed to prevent national starvation after victory, was not a gift. It was commercial debt carrying interest. Every single year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Through the economic boom of the 1950s, the stagnation of the 1970s, the Thatcher Revolution, and the Blair years, the payments continued without interruption. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. Think about that date. 61 years after the guns fell silent, 61 years after the victory parades, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. The story of victory's price utterly demolishes the notion that wars have winners. In the modern era of total war, conflict is a negative-sum game, where even the victors lose. Germany lost the war and was physically destroyed, but Britain won the war and was financially destroyed. The only true winner was the United States. The American economy doubled during the war years. American territory was untouched by bombing. America held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves by 1945. And through the mechanisms of Lend-Lease, the Destroyer Deal, and post-war loans, the United States successfully dismantled the British Empire's economic structure, opening global markets to American goods and American influence. The United States didn't conquer the British Empire with military force. It purchased it, it acquired British assets, strategic bases, and geopolitical influence through a distressed asset sale orchestrated by the U.S. Treasury. For the British people, the legacy of 1941 through 1947 left a permanent scar in the national consciousness. It created a persistent sense of decline, a feeling that the nation's greatest days were in the past. It shaped the special relationship with America, which has always been a polite euphemism for dependence. When Winston Churchill sat down to write that letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved Britain from Hitler's tyranny, but he also signed the deed transferring Britain's future to American hands. He traded empire for survival. It was a deal that absolutely had to be made. There was no alternative. Britain would have fallen without American aid, but the cost was the future itself. Britain emerged from World War II as a moral giant but an economic shadow. It had spent centuries of accumulated wealth to purchase freedom for Europe. It was an extraordinarily noble sacrifice, perhaps the noblest in human history. But examined through the cold lens of economics, it was a liquidation. The British Empire didn't fall through military defeat. It was sold off piece by piece, asset by asset, to pay the bill for doing what was morally right. This is the story that history often forgets. This is the price that victory demands. And this is why the Second World War, despite being remembered as the Good War, left Britain broken victorious on the battlefield, but defeated in the counting house. Subscribe and follow for more untold stories from history, because understanding the past is the only way to prepare for what's coming next.